Okay, so like everybody's talking about CI/CD these days, right?
Mm.
You need a pipeline, you need automate, you need all this stuff. But then you actually start looking into it and it's like, whoa,
Yeah.
there are a million different tools, a million different ways to do it.
Absolutely. It can be,
How do you even choose?
it can get overwhelming pretty quickly. I mean, even for people who've been in the DevOps world for a while, the tooling landscape is changing so rapidly, it can be tough to stay on top of it all.
That's why we're doing this deep dive today. We're going to dig into an article that really breaks things down nicely. It's called How to Choose Between AWS CodeBuild, Jenkins, and GitHub Actions for Your CI/CD Pipeline. It's by Stella Oro.
Oh, Stella's great.
Yeah, she's awesome. And this was published over on DV Community just on March 25th, so super fresh.
Yeah.
So for anybody listening who maybe hasn't quite jumped into the world of CI/CD pipelines yet, can you just give us that like quick elevator pitch for what this is all about and why people are making such a big deal about it?
Yeah, sure. So CICD, it stands for continuous integration and continuous deployment. And it's all about, as you said, automating that software development pipeline. Imagine like you're working on a piece of code.
Right.
You make some changes. You want to make sure those changes are good. They don't break anything. So you run your tests, you build your application, and then you want to get it out there, deploy it to your users.
Right.
CICD takes all those steps, all those manual error-prone steps, and automates them. So you can go from code change to deployment much faster
Yeah,
and with a lot more confidence that things aren't going to break.
exactly. And so Stella, in her article, she really focuses on these three big players in the CI/CD world:
Mm,
AWS CodeBuild, Jenkins, and GitHub Actions.
right.
And our goal today is to like pull out those key insights from Stella's writing.
Right.
Really help you listening understand the core differences between these tools so that you can start figuring out which one might be the right fit for you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about cutting through the noise, getting to the heart of what matters.
Exactly. So no need to read the whole article. We'll give you the need to know info. So let's start with AWS CodeBuild. What's the sort of fundamental idea, the core concept behind CodeBuild as Stella presents it?
So the way Stella describes it, and I think this is a really great way to think about it, is that AWS CodeBuild is a fully managed service. So you don't have to worry about setting up servers, managing infrastructure.
Right.
You just tell CodeBuild what you need to build, and it takes care of all the underlying stuff for you.
So it's like AWS taking care of the whole workshop. You just show up with your project, and they've got all the tools ready to go.
That's a great analogy. They handle the servers, the scaling, the security, all of that.
That sounds pretty appealing, especially if you're already using AWS for other things.
Yeah.
What are some of the other key features or aspects of CodeBuild that Stella highlights?
So one of the things that she points out is the pricing model. You only pay for the compute time you actually use. It's billed by the minute.
Oh, so if you're not actively building anything, you're not racking up charges.
Exactly. So for teams that have kind of like spiky build needs, or maybe they don't have builds running all the time,
Right.
it can be really cost effective.
Makes sense.
Another big advantage that Stella points out is CodeBuild's integration with the rest of the AWS ecosystem. It plays nicely with other AWS services like S3 for storing your build artifacts, ECR for your Docker images, Lambda for serverless functions. It's all kind of like part of the same family.
So you got that nice tight integration if you're already all in on AWS.
Right. And then she also talks about the ability to use custom build environments using Docker images. So you can really customize the environment where your build is running
Okay.
to make sure you have all the right tools, dependencies, libraries, all of that.
So it's flexible in that way. You can kind of tailor it to your specific needs.
Yeah. And of course, being part of AWS, you get the benefit of their security infrastructure.
Right.
So you've got things like IAM for controlling access, VPC for network isolation. So it's pretty robust in terms of security.
All right. So it sounds like CodeBuild is very much geared towards that AWS-centric workflow. But how do you actually, tell it what to do? Like, how do you configure CodeBuild to build your project?
So the way Stella describes it, you use a file called buildspec.iml. And this file, it basically lives alongside your code. It's part of your repository.
Mm.
And it defines, in a very declarative way, all the steps of your build process.
Like a recipe for your build.
Yeah, exactly like a recipe. You specify, what needs to happen in what order, and CodeBuild just follows those instructions.
Cool. Does she give an example of what a buildspec.iml file might look like?
Yeah, she does. She walks through a really good example. So you start with the version of the build spec format you're using. Then you have these different phases,
Okay.
like an install phase, where you might say, okay, I need Node.js version 16 for this project.
Got it.
Then you have a pre-build phase where you might do things like installing your dependencies with npm install. Then the build phase is where the real action happens. You run your tests with something like npm test. You create your production build with npm run build.
Right.
You can even have a post-build phase for any cleanup or final tasks you need to do.
Gotcha.
And finally, you define your artifacts, which are the output files you want to keep from the build.
So like your finished application code, maybe some configuration files, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So it might be your dist folder with your built application, your package.json file, even an appspec.iml if you're using AWS CodeDeploy, all relative to a certain directory that you define in the build spec file.
All right, so you've got this nice structured YAML file
Right.
that lays out your entire build process.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. So that's AWS CodeBuild, fully managed, tightly integrated with AWS, uses this YAML-based configuration file.
Right.
Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Jenkins. So how does Stella sort of frame Jenkins in the CI/CD landscape? What's its kind of essential nature?
So Stella describes Jenkins as an open source automation server.
Okay. And this has been around for quite a while. It's been a staple in the CI/CD world since 2011.
So it's got that kind of long history, that maturity.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
And the key thing with Jenkins is that it's self-managed.
Self-managed, okay.
So unlike CodeBuild, where AWS handles all the infrastructure for you,
Right.
with Jenkins, you're responsible for setting it up, maintaining it, keeping it running. It's like, owning your own workshop instead of renting one.
So it's that trade-off, right?
Yeah.
More control, but also more responsibility.
Absolutely.
What are some of the key features that Stella highlights for Jenkins?
So one of the biggest things with Jenkins is its huge plugin ecosystem. There are like over 1,500 plugins available.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's enormous. And this means you can integrate Jenkins with practically any other tool or service you can think of.
So pretty much whatever your workflow is, whatever other tools you're using, you can probably find a way to plug them into Jenkins.
Yeah, there's probably a plugin for it.
She also mentions its flexibility in terms of deployment. You can run Jenkins on your own servers, in the cloud, or even in a hybrid setup.
So it's very adaptable to different environments.
Exactly. And then she also talks about its distributed builds capability. So Jenkins can use what's called a master agent architecture,
Okay.
where you have a central Jenkins master server, and then you can have these agents, these worker nodes that actually run the builds.
So you can kind of spread the workload out over multiple machines.
Right, exactly. And that allows you to scale your builds, run them in parallel, handle more complex workflows.
So if you've got a lot of builds going on, Jenkins can kind of rise to the occasion.
Yeah. And lastly, being open source, Jenkins has a big active community.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of support available, a lot of people sharing knowledge and building plugins. It's a very vibrant ecosystem.
Yeah. All right, so Jenkins, it's that self-managed, highly customizable, very flexible option.
Right.
But how do you define those workflows, those build processes in Jenkins?
So the main way you do that, Stella explains, is using a Jenkins file.
Another special file.
Yeah, another file.
Yeah.
And again, this typically lives in your code repository.
Okay.
And it's where you define your Jenkins pipeline.
Pipeline. Okay.
And the way you define this pipeline, it's a little bit more script-like than the YAML-based approach we saw with CodeBuild. It's a bit more programmatic.
Okay.
She gives an example. So you'd start by defining your pipeline, and then you specify an agent. This is where you say, okay, I want this pipeline to run on a machine with these specific characteristics.
Okay.
And she gives an example of using a Docker image, Node Port 16 Alpine for a Node.js environment.
Okay.
Then within the pipeline, you break things down into stages. So you might have an install stage where you run npm install to get your dependencies.
Right.
Then a test stage where you run npm tests to run your tests.
That makes sense.
Build stage, npm run build. And then maybe an archive stage where you use a step like archive artifacts to save the output of your build, the dist folder, for example. So you're kind of writing, it feels a bit more like scripting those steps, those commands you want to execute.
So CodeBuild is more like, here's what I need, and Jenkins is more like, here are the commands to run to get it done.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've covered AWS CodeBuild, we've covered Jenkins.
Right.
Let's move on to our third contender here, GitHub Actions.
Okay.
What's the core idea behind GitHub Actions as Stella describes it?
So GitHub Actions, as Stella points out, is GitHub's own CICD solution. It was introduced back in 2019,
Okay.
and its biggest strength, I think, is that it's built right into GitHub.
So it's like baked into the platform where your code already lives.
Exactly. It's not a separate service you have to connect to or configure. It's just there.
That sounds super convenient.
Yeah.
What are some of the key features that she highlights for GitHub Actions?
So as I mentioned, that integration with GitHub is huge. You don't need separate accounts. You don't need to connect different services. It's all just part of your GitHub repository. The way you define your workflows is using YAML files, and these files live in a special directory within your repository.github workflows.
So it's kind of like that buildspec.iml file,
Oh.
but it's specific to GitHub Actions.
Right. And then there's the GitHub Actions Marketplace, which is a collection of pre-built actions that you can just plug into your workflows.
Oh, so like reusable building blocks for common CI/CD tasks.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel for every single step of your build process.
That's cool.
Other cool features? Matrix builds, which let you easily test your code across different operating systems and environments.
Okay.
Event-driven workflows, which means you can trigger your builds based on things like code pushes, pull requests, releases, all sorts of events within GitHub.
Oh, so it's very reactive to what's happening in your repository.
Yeah. And then built-in secret management. So you can securely store sensitive information like API keys or credentials without having to worry about exposing them in your code.
Nice. So that's like they've really thought about security and convenience here.
Yeah, definitely.
But how do you actually configure these workflows, these YAML files? What does that process look like, according to Stella?
So she gives a great example of a Node.js CI workflow.
Okay.
And you start by defining, when this workflow should run. So in her example, it runs on every push to the repository and on every pull request that's opened against the main branch.
Got it.
Then you define your jobs, and within each job, you specify the environment where it should run.
Okay.
She uses a pre-configured Ubuntu environment, Ubuntu latest as an example.
Right.
And then the real meat of the workflow is in the steps.
Right.
So each step can either be a pre-built action from the marketplace
Uh-huh.
or a run step where you just execute a shell command.
Okay.
So she shows how you can use an action called action checkout at v2 to fetch your code from the repository.
Okay.
And then an action called action setup node at v2 to set up Node.js version 16 and configure NPM caching so your builds are faster. Then you can have run steps where you run your usual commands, like npm install to install dependencies, npm test to run your tests, npm run build to build your application.
Makes sense.
And finally, you can use another action upload artifact at v2 to upload your built application, the dist folder, as an artifact, so you can download it or use it in later steps.
So it's this nice combination of pre-built actions and your own custom commands.
Yeah. And Stella really emphasizes how easy it is to get started with GitHub Actions, how it kind of just fits naturally into the way you're already working with GitHub.
That's great. All right, so we've got a good overview now of each of these three tools: CodeBuild, Jenkins, and GitHub Actions.
Yeah.
But let's dig into some of those direct comparisons that Stella makes in her article, starting with, the setup and configuration process. What are the key takeaways there?
So when it comes to setup, Stella points out that AWS CodeBuild, you typically need to be somewhat familiar with AWS and how it works. You're usually configuring it through the AWS console, or you might be using some kind of infrastructure as code tool. Right.
You need to set up your IAM roles, your permissions, define that buildspec.iml file. It's not necessarily super complicated,
Okay.
but it does require a bit of AWS knowledge. And she says, it's a good choice if you're already heavily invested in AWS.
Yeah, if you're living in that AWS world, it probably feels pretty natural.
Right. Jenkins, on the other hand, she points out that there's a bit more operational overhead.
Okay.
You got to set up a server or a container, install Jenkins, manage all those plugins,
Right.
potentially set up your build agent. So there's definitely more hands-on management involved. But the flip side is you have a lot more control.
Right. So you get that flexibility, but you also got to do the work.
Exactly. And then GitHub Actions, she highlights this as being the simplest to set up,
Okay.
especially if your project's already on GitHub. You basically just create that .github workflows directory in your repository, drop in your YAML files, and you're good to go.
So it's kind of like the least friction, the least amount of setup required.
Yeah, very developer friendly. Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, what about integration capabilities? How do these three tools compare in terms of how well they play with other services and platforms?
So as you might expect, AWS CodeBuild, she says it has excellent integration with all those other AWS services.
Yeah.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah, totally.
It can also work with other common source code providers, and it has features for sending out notifications through SNS or storing your build artifacts in S3.
Yeah.
So it's really optimized for those AWS
Right.
environments.
It's all about that ecosystem.
Yeah. Jenkins, she says, has the most comprehensive integration capabilities because of that massive plugin library we talked about.
Right. Those 1,500 plugins.
Exactly. So it supports all the major source control systems. It can work with different cloud providers. It can talk to all sorts of communication tools. It integrates with different container registries. Basically, if there's a tool or service out there that you need to work with, Jenkins can probably talk to it.
So it's kind of the most adaptable in that way.
Yeah, very adaptable. And then GitHub Actions, obviously it integrates seamlessly with GitHub itself.
All right, that's its home turf.
Exactly. And the marketplace is growing all the time. They're adding more and more actions that integrate with other cloud providers, other tools. But its primary strength, I think, is still in those GitHub-centric workflows.
So if you're living in the GitHub world, it's probably your go-to.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
All right. Yeah. Now let's talk about scalability and performance. As your projects grow, as you have more builds happening, how do these three tools handle that increased load?
So Stella points out that when it comes to scalability, AWS CodeBuild really shines. It scales automatically based on your needs.
Okay.
You don't have to do any manual configuration. AWS just takes care of spinning up more resources as you need them, and there's basically no limit to how many builds you can run concurrently.
Wow. So it can handle pretty much anything you throw at it.
Yeah, it's designed for that kind of scale.
Nice.
Jenkins, on the other hand, you typically have to scale it manually. So you need to add more build agents, more worker nodes as your build volume increases. And obviously, you're limited by the resources that you've provisioned.
Right. So it's a bit more hands-on. You have to kind of keep an eye on things and adjust as you go.
Exactly. And while Jenkins does support distributed builds, it's still something you need to manage actively.
Okay.
GitHub Actions, it kind of falls somewhere in between. The cloud-based runners that GitHub Actions uses, those scale automatically to some extent.
Okay.
They do have usage limits. And if you need more control, you can also use self-hosted runners, where
Okay.
you basically provide your own build infrastructure. So it's kind of a mix of automatic scaling and manual control.
All right. So each one has its own approach to scaling.
Right.
Now let's talk about the money question. Cost. How do the cost structures of these three tools compare?
So cost is always a big consideration. Stella explains that with AWS CodeBuild, you're paying for what you use. It's a pay-per-minute model,
Okay.
no charge for idle time. And they have tiered pricing, so the more you use, the lower your per-minute cost gets.
Makes sense.
Plus, they have a free tier, so you can get started and experiment without spending anything.
That's always nice.
So for teams that have, maybe unpredictable build needs or they're not running builds constantly, CodeBuild can be pretty cost-effective.
Right. What about Jenkins?
Jenkins, you have to think about those upfront and ongoing infrastructure costs.
Right, because you're managing everything yourself.
Exactly. So you're paying for your servers, your containers, your electricity, all of that, but there's no per build fee.
Okay.
So if you're running a ton of builds, Jenkins could potentially be cheaper in the long run.
So it's kind of a trade-off, that upfront investment versus those ongoing per build costs.
Yeah, exactly. And then GitHub Actions, they have a free tier, which is actually quite generous, especially for public repositories.
Okay.
And then they have paid tiers where you get more build minutes, more storage. So it's a pretty predictable pricing model.
All right, so a good range of options there depending on your budget and your usage patterns. Now let's talk about security. How do these three tools approach keeping your code and your builds safe?
So security is obviously super important. Stella highlights that AWS CodeBuild, it benefits from all those security features that AWS provides.
Right.
So you've got granular control through IAM roles. You can isolate your builds using VPC. You can use Secrets Manager to securely store sensitive information.
Right.
And AWS has a whole bunch of compliance certifications.
So if security is a top priority, CodeBuild has a lot to offer.
Yeah, absolutely. Jenkins, it relies more on you, the user, to configure it securely.
Okay.
So it has features like role-based access control. There are tons of security plugins you can install. You can isolate Jenkins on its own network. You've got audit logging, a dedicated credentials plugin.
So it's got the tools, but it's up to you to use them correctly.
Yeah, you're responsible for implementing best practices. And then GitHub Actions, it kind of sits in the middle. It's a hosted service, so GitHub takes care of a lot of the security for you.
Right.
They encrypt your secrets. They have features like OIDC integration for secure authentication.
Okay.
They have these protected environments that you can use for sensitive deployments.
Right.
But you can also use self-hosted runners if you need more control over your build environment and its security.
So you've got that option to kind of tailor the security
Right.
to your needs.
Right.
All right. So Stella's article, it really provides a lot of great information, different perspectives on these three tools.
Yeah.
So for somebody who's listening to this, let's say they're, heavily invested in the AWS ecosystem, what parts of her analysis would be most relevant to them?
So if you're all in on AWS, I think you'd really want to pay attention to the sections where she talks about how CodeBuild integrates with other AWS services, like understanding how to use S3 for your artifacts, how to use ECR for your container images, how to integrate with Code Pipeline if you're using that, how to leverage IAM roles and VPC for security. Those are all really important aspects if you're operating within that AWS environment.
Yeah. Makes sense. Now, what if you're somebody who needs a lot of flexibility, a lot of control? Maybe you're dealing with a hybrid environment. You've got some cloud stuff. You've got some legacy systems. What should they focus on?
I think that person would really benefit from the sections on Jenkins,
Okay.
especially the part where she talks about the plugin ecosystem, because that's really where Jenkins shines. If you need to connect to a specific tool or service, chances are there's a Jenkins plugin for it.
Right.
And she also talks about the self-hosted nature of Jenkins, which gives you a lot of control over your build environment.
Right.
And the fact that the workflows are highly customizable. So if you need that fine-grained control over every aspect of your build process, Jenkins can definitely provide that.
Okay. And finally, what about somebody who's, their projects are mostly on GitHub and they really value ease of use, simplicity, being able to get up and running quickly? What would you point them to?
Definitely the sections on GitHub Actions.
Okay.
Because Stella makes it clear that that setup process is super straightforward. You're just creating a few YAML files in your repository. You're leveraging those pre-built actions from the marketplace.
Right.
And she talks about how well it integrates with GitHub events, so you can trigger your builds based on things like code pushes or pull requests. It's a very streamlined experience.
So it's all about that tight integration and that ease of use.
Exactly.
Stella also, towards the end of the article, she touches on some of the recent developments in each of these platforms, some of the latest features, and kind of hints at where things might be going in the future.
Yeah.
What are some of the broader trends that you see emerging in the CI/CD space based on those updates?
I think one of the big trends is definitely tighter integration within ecosystems.
Okay.
So like we were talking about, AWS is making their services work better together. GitHub's enhancing their Actions marketplace. Even Jenkins is improving its integration with modern cloud-native tools.
Right, so it's kind of like each platform is becoming more cohesive.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's also a big focus on developer experience,
Okay.
making it easier for developers to define their workflows, visualize them, manage them.
Right.
We're seeing more reusable components, more intuitive interfaces.
Yeah, so less of that YAML wrestling, more kind of drag and drop visual stuff.
Exactly. And of course, security is always a top concern.
Right.
So we're seeing things like automated dependency scanning, more integrated security checks.
Okay.
That's becoming more and more standard.
So security is being baked into the process more and more.
Yeah. And finally, I think cost optimization is always the big driver.
Right.
So we're seeing efforts to provide more efficient build environments, things like using ARM-based architectures, which can potentially lower your costs.
So it's not just about, building and deploying faster. It's also about doing it more cost effectively.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So to wrap things up here, based on Stella's article, what are those core differentiating factors that really help us understand what each of these tools is best suited for?
So I think the way Stella lays it out, AWS CodeBuild, it's that managed service tightly integrated with AWS. It's a great choice if you're already heavily using AWS and you want that kind of hands-off experience.
Right. You just want things to work.
Yeah. Jenkins, it's that open source, self-hosted option, super flexible, highly customizable, huge plugin ecosystem. So if you need that control, that ability to integrate with anything, Jenkins is your tool.
Okay.
And then GitHub Actions, it's all about that ease of use, that tight integration with GitHub. So if you're living in the GitHub world, if you want to get up and running quickly, GitHub Actions is a great choice.
All right. And what about some of those key pieces of advice that Stella gives to people who are trying to decide between these tools?
So she has some really practical recommendations, like start with a pilot project, pick a small project.
Okay.
Try out the tool, see how it works in your environment.
Right. Get your hands dirty.
Yeah, exactly. And be honest about your team's skills and their readiness to adopt a particular tool.
Right. Because some of these tools have a steeper learning curve than others.
Exactly. And think about your future growth. How many builds are you going to be running? How complex are your workflows going to get?
Right.
Make sure you're choosing a tool that can scale with you.
Makes sense.
And she also emphasizes considering not just the direct costs, but the indirect costs as well. Like, how much time is it going to take to manage the tool, to train your team?
Like hidden costs.
Yeah, exactly. And she also suggests considering a hybrid approach. Maybe you use different tools for different parts of your workflow.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be all one or the other.
So you can mix and match a little bit.
Yeah. And then if you're thinking about migrating from an existing CI/CD system, really think about the effort involved, make sure it's worth it.
Okay, so a lot of really good practical advice there.
Yeah.
And it really highlights that choosing a CI/CD tool, it's not just a technical decision, it's a strategic decision.
Absolutely. It impacts your entire software development process.
Right. And on that note, here's something to kind of ponder as we wrap up here. Given how quickly things are evolving in the cloud and the DevOps world,
Yeah.
do you think these lines between these different CI/CD approaches are going to start to blur even more in the future?
I think that's definitely a possibility.
Yeah.
And what new paradigms might emerge to make things even simpler, even more secure?
Lots to think about there. Before we go, we want to give a big shout out to Stella Achar-Oro for her fantastic article that we've been discussing today.
Yes, thank you, Stella.
The full title again is How to Choose Between AWS CodeBuild, Jenkins, and GitHub Actions for Your CICD Pipeline.
And you can find it on DEV Community. Go to dev.tostellachararo to read the full article.
Yeah, check it out.
And explore some of her other great writing on cloud computing and DevOps.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive with us. Hopefully this has given you a better understanding of these powerful tools and helped you take a step closer to choosing the right CI/CD solution for your projects.
Yeah, happy building.